Deconstructing Darwinism Part 2. In the first talk, I discussed the spirit from which Darwinism emerged. 19th century British imperialism and its mythology, its worldview about itself. Now I would like to delve further into the philosophical critique of Darwinism to demonstrate that as a grand narrative, as a system, and make no mistake about it, it is a system, contrary to what many of its proponents and theorists and professors say. It comes out of a specific context and presents a specific system. Now, it's true that in our day, it has developed into different strands, different theories, different types of proponents that will try to minimize the claims that it made formerly. So whereas Darwinism at one time presented a grand narrative of human progress and racial theory, supposedly now it is a very specific biological or genetic theory. The problem with that is that that is not where the theory comes from. It's just like the misappropriation of creationists who think that creationism can be divorced from some specific theology. Like, well, we can just have a generic creationism that doesn't really have any connection to any specific religious text because we perceive there to be levels of order, design, and complexity in the world. That's just as faulty a starting point as is the modern notion within Darwinism proper in our day, that we can have a very hyper-specialized view of genetics or biology that utilizes all these Darwinian ideas, but it doesn't have really anything anymore to do with the grand narrative that Charles Darwin presented. And both of those approaches are wrong. And they're wrong because they're both based on Enlightenment epistemology. So I hate to go back into it, but it's necessary to understand how flawed and how absurd Enlightenment theories of epistemology and anthropology and, well, its basic rejection of metaphysics are. And, you know, the perennial response to this is always, well, if that was true, then we couldn't have scientists that make discoveries. How could they discover things if they were wrong in their starting point? And that is, it's always difficult to explain this, but if you study philosophy and epistemology, you can understand how that is. Because you can have a system that has an erroneous starting point, but within the system it can still make advances or make discoveries. So I might think as an individual that all reality is purely matter. But let's say I master mathematics to a high degree, and I go out and, you know, perform some experimentation with electromagnetism and prove some thesis that I have about electromagnetism and, you know, use a bunch of complex equations. Well, the fact that at a smaller, localized level, my theories about, you know, whatever might have been the case in this example were proven true, and my algorithms came out accurate, it doesn't follow from that just because one localized, smaller scale aspect of my system or my belief system, my worldview, worked pragmatically, that therefore the entire schema or paradigm that I believe is correct. And it should be really obvious just from the course of scientific discovery itself that this is the case. If that weren't the case, then everything that Newton believed would have been wrong, because we no longer believe that his principles are accurate as pertains to the subatomic level. So once that was shown to be not accurate at a subatomic level, it doesn't follow from that therefore everything that Newton said was wrong. There were certain foundational assumptions that had not occurred to Newton to question, and he did not have the ability to study to the degree that we are able to today. So we were able to question those founding assumptions of Newtonian physics and advance and go in a different direction. But when we consider the philosophy of science, it's really this arena, this approach that shows the inadequacy, the incoherency, and impossibility of Darwinian theory. So back to my point about grand narratives and schemes, even though there are a lot of modern proponents of this worldview, and it is a worldview, who will deny that it is a worldview, it becomes pretty evident when you survey the works coming out of this mindset that it still presents the worldview. I mean, when you look at the new atheists, when you look at Dawkins and Dennett and Harris and all these guys, the worldview that they're presenting still contains all of the same broad spectrum interpretations and narratives about, human progress, advance, and rationalism and scientism. It still has all those same ideas that were present in the older Darwinism. When we look at someone like Teilhard de Chardin, his philosophical gobbledygook that is a bunch of metaphysical baggage carried over from the classical Darwinism that tries to mesh with a kind of esoteric version of Christianity. He's a great example of a modern paleontologist who kept all of the Darwinian baggage and tried to be a little more, I guess, consistent with not denying metaphysics. So Teilhard is a interesting example of a Darwinian theorist who continued the tradition of all the metaphysics that go along with it. Excuse me. While at the same time, most of the modern proponents of this scheme want to distance themselves from any kind of metaphysical claims or metaphysical truths. So when we encounter, as I did with a buddy of mine on Facebook in a discussion about this, when we encounter people who defend Darwinian approaches, theories, perspectives, evolutionary theories, the assumption almost across the board in all of these people, and again, in 8-9 years of higher education, academia, I experienced this, extensively. The reasoning seems to be pretty standard and pretty consistent. So we can group their argumentation and their response together because I've seen it so many times. It's just a consistent pattern. And the response is generally something like, well, until we have a better presentation of how it works and how it came about, why it came about, etc., life, that is, from creationists or a better creationist model, until there are creationists that are doing all this great work that the evolutionary theorists are doing, we don't have any reason to believe the creationist perspective. And what I want to get into in this, and my argument here in this presentation will be that Darwinian theory is completely impossible on its own philosophical grounds. And when we examine the philosophy of science, when we examine metaphysics and epistemology, we're going to see that it's completely contradictory in all the things that it presents. And I think, even though not many people are going to probably agree or believe what I'm saying, this is actually the approach that needs to be taken with this worldview, because it's such complete nonsense as a whole. And we can talk, or we can just say these different worldviews. Now, the response here will be, well, you're just saying that these different evolutionary thinkers and theorists and presentations are various worldviews. They're not. They're just making, localized statements about specific areas of study like biology. So when a theorist in the evolutionary camp who writes about, his, for example, when I had a debate with an ex-girlfriend's boyfriend, who's an MIT grad professor / assistant. I don't know what he is, but he's an MIT guy, and he studies rat hearing, the hearing of rats. So when he does all these experiments that are based on, his perception of Darwinism, he's, the argument from the opponent is that guy is not making a grand claim about existence. He's only stating something very minuscule. He's only tacking on a footnote in the history of human knowledge as pertains to how we understand the natural world. So his theories about rat hearing don't ultimately make any metaphysical claims or affect the world as a whole or belief systems. They're not. He's not concerned with belief systems. He's only concerned with advancing human knowledge as pertains to rat hearing. Well, let's examine that. The assumption here is, again, as I keep hammering away, part of old 19th century Victorian rationalist Enlightenment empiricism. The assumption being that we humans are neutral observers of all of our experience, all the phenomena that we see. We come into a lab, we wear a lab coat, we come into a classroom, and with no prior presuppositions, no prior assumptions, no programming, we simply neutrally observe, like a blank slate, a series of facts, objective presentations, arguments. We process them, and the smartest ones of us then accept that information, and we process it, and we present new findings about whatever the localized, relatively mundane topic of investigation is. We're studying earthworms, and we're going to find out the age of an earthworm, and we're going to study the biological mechanism of the earthworm and how it relates to the ecosphere. So the argument of the opponent goes, that is not concerned with worldviews. That's not concerned with metaphysics. We don't care about that. We're just pragmatically introducing studies to advance human knowledge about something very small and piecemeal, because that's the only way to do this. So we don't have any preconceived constructs about the origins of it, or how it relates to everything else. We're just going to examine this phenomena in front of us, the various earthworms in the lab. Well, again, that view of how science is done, or how human knowledge works, or how metaphysics doesn't really matter or exist anymore, is itself a vast philosophical belief. Vast in its implications. So what the philosopher, myself, does when he comes to these kinds of questions is that he understands implications. He understands what is implied by saying something like, well, metaphysics doesn't matter anymore. Now, the particular person that I was interacting with may not feel that way. He probably does believe that there's a place for metaphysics. But in general, the modern atheistic, Darwinistic, evolutionary type thinker believes that metaphysics is something that doesn't matter and is old superstitious baggage. And by metaphysics, I'm not talking about the Barnes & Noble section of witchcraft in the bookstore. I'm talking about the philosophical discipline of metaphysics. And the reason that he thinks that is because the Enlightenment theorists basically came to the conclusion that metaphysics is something that's impossible to know, because it presumes that the mind can tap into and connect with objective existent realities in the external world, when with the Kantian and Humean and Lockean revolution, the conclusion by these so-called geniuses was that the mind of man cannot have any access to external objective existing realities. It can only work with the constructs that exist in the human mind itself. So we can sort of, like a puzzle, put together all the incoming data that our blank slate mind records, but that doesn't mean that anything that we're putting together in our puzzle pieces in our mind and constructing a worldview and scientific theory, blah, 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 that doesn't mean that any of that's actually going on in the world. It's just we're merely studying the phenomena of experience. But back to my point about metaphysics, again, it's crucial to understand, my whole argument, or the entire perspective from which I'm coming, what I think is ultimately the heart of my argument and deconstruction of this Darwinian narrative, the scheme, is that it's impossible to avoid absolute metaphysical and epistemological claims. For example, if I come to the table and I say there are no metaphysical claims, right? Let's say that I firmly believe that, and I've been instructed by numerous professors, and I have my PhD in epistemology and metaphysics, and I've come to the conclusion that based on modern theory, there's no way that we can conclusively make any kind of metaphysical or epistemic claim with certainty. Now, it's a very simple refutation. We all who, most of my readers and listeners will probably be aware of the classic refutation of relativism in terms of epistemology, where we say, when you make the claim that there's no certain knowledge, that claim itself is a claim to certain knowledge, and therefore relativism is self-refuting. Well, guess what? When you make the claim that there are no metaphysics, or we cannot know metaphysics, or there are no metaphysical truths or principles, there are no essences, there is no such thing as being that's sensible, that itself is a metaphysical claim. Why? Well, because when I make the statement that we cannot make metaphysical claims, not only am I making an epistemic claim, or a claim about epistemology, a claim about knowledge, any claim about knowledge also implies or necessitates other claims or beliefs about metaphysics and even about ethics. Now, that's a longer argument, but I've made this point many times, and it's an important point, because if you don't grasp this, if you don't see this, you're going to continue running around in the hamster wheel of Darwinism and scientific naturalism and scientism and evolutionary theory, thinking that that is the be-all, end-all of human wisdom. The claim itself, there are no metaphysical truths. There is no externally objective existing essences or being. Any kind of claim like that necessarily makes a universal claim about all being. Even if it's a denial of being, it still is making the claim to some universal knowledge of, or principle that doesn't exist. And the way that we show that is to look at what that assumes. So the guy who's sitting at the table arguing with me or debating with me that says there are no metaphysical truths, in order for that claim to be true, he assumes by making that claim that there's an individual mind or self that he has that's existing over time, that's able to come to a conclusion about reality that is universal in scope. I hope that's clear. I hope that makes sense. And that's unavoidable. I mean, that's just the way things are. You can't get around that. And in my probably 100 debates with people who have this mindset, they cannot, I mean, some of them, leave that mindset and go on to bigger and better things. But most of them just can't grasp this. They can't understand because it goes beyond word games. This is not a word game. This is a tremendous philosophical truth and principle that you can't avoid. Any claim that you make at all, it doesn't matter how insignificant or mundane or ridiculous or silly, even jokes, philosophically speaking, will presume all kinds of necessary truths that must also be the case. And this is the whole heart of my argument, the whole heart of my presentation. This is what it's all about. This is how you completely deconstruct this worldview and show that it's utter nonsense. And it's not very hard to do this. Anybody can actually do this with a grounding in basic philosophy and an understanding of basic logic and an understanding of what we call transcendental arguments. So again, to re-emphasize the point, the claim that there are no metaphysical truths is itself loaded with a bunch of metaphysical baggage. Even if the guy who makes the claim denies it, it doesn't matter, right? That's just a power play. I can't sit here and say, there are no metaphysical truths, at the same time assume a bunch of metaphysical stuff, and then turn around and say, well, no, I'm not. Now, 99% of the people that I have debated with, that's what they do. They just sort of turn it around like a power play, like, well, no, it's not true because I say so. And that, of course, is not obeying the laws of reasoning, logic, and argumentation, and just being arbitrary. That's just the fallacy of authority. I say so. I say there's no metaphysical truths. That makes it so. No, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. And by the way, you can translate a claim like there are no metaphysical truths into a logical framework, and you can show logically, translate it mathematically, that that's a universal claim. Now, what's the heart of all my argumentation here? This is where I can completely bring down the whole superstructure. In this worldview, there is no such thing as a unifying principle. I'm going to state it again. In this worldview, in any worldview that denies an externally objective, existent, omniscient mind, God, there are no and can be no unifying principles. Now you say, well, what does that mean? Why do I care? What does that mean? Well, when you make the claim, for example, there's no metaphysical truths, let's say for the sake of argument that you did make that claim, even if the listener, you guys out there, even if you don't believe that, let's just say that you're making that argument. In order for you to make that argument, in order for that to be the case, even though we know it's not, let's just say for the sake of argument that's the case, you need much more than just sitting at a table and making a fancy rhetorical claim. You need all kinds of things to be the case. Okay? And what we might call this a precondition. You need, for example, for you as an individual, as a self, to be an individual self, right? Because if you're just a programmed robot that's coming in, you were programmed to say this, let's say, well, that's not a very good argument, because we know that this is not The assumption then in that case would be that this is not a person who's actually engaging in a reasoned argument. That's just some programmed robot blurting out beeps and boops and beeps according to what he was told to do. The assumption here is that there is some self, even if you don't believe in a soul or whatever, a mind, as many of the materialist Darwinists don't. The assumption when you come to the table to the debate is that you are some kind of existing self. And you didn't just pop into existence at the time of the debate. You actually had some kind of history, some past. You came from some culture. You came from some race. You came from some kind of education, some kind of mindset. You've got some kind of history that informs your present presentation at the debate. And if that's the case, then the argument presumes more than on the face of it seems to say. So even though the guy making this argument wants it to just be a simple claim, so he thinks, or so he wants it to be, and even though he doesn't want there to be a bunch of metaphysical baggage, isn't it obviously the case that there's a bunch of metaphysical baggage brought along with it? Of course there is. It's inescapable. You can't get away from it. And again, the whole thinking behind how you could even do something like that is all something that emerged from a certain historic new worldview. It's all out of this Enlightenment empiricist tradition. And even though it's been annihilated philosophically 100 times over, the majority of academia doesn't know anything about philosophy. They don't know anything about reason and argumentation and metaphysics and all these things that are obviously true. They don't know anything about that. They are studied in their own discipline. They know all about biology on some micro level, some rat hearing, but they don't know anything about how is it possible for rat hearing to even be the case. And so, they because philosophy and so much of modern academia is taught as just total garbage, I guess it's somewhat understandable why they wouldn't consider philosophy or consider metaphysics or consider these kind of questions. I mean, it's presented as something that's just basically a bunch of nonsense, and I'm talking about at the local university level. It's presented as just garbage, just intellectual farting. It's like we just go to this class and we sit around and talk about how our dream was like reality, man, and maybe reality is a dream, man. I mean, that's your typical philosophy 101 class. So, it's understandable that most people who go into biology or physics, probably don't go any further than philosophy 101, and so they aren't aware of all these other types of things. And it's also, modernity has basically raised the philosophy foundations to their core. Philosophy is seen as something irrelevant, and that is a big long other story that goes back to the history of the American tradition, which is basically only produced some analytical philosophy and a whole school called pragmatism, which is essentially worthless. And it's so, but pragmatism is relevant here because the real reason why someone would come to the table with this kind of mindset in large part has to do with pragmatism. Because the whole thinking behind this is, well, if we can produce results in the lab and advance the knowledge of the earthworm and rat hearing, who cares? Who cares about the worldview? We've made progress. We've made an advancement. We now know more about the earthworm and the earwax that the rat has because we've done 10 years of study on rat ears, right? So in that regard, the assumption for these people is largely also pragmatic. So it's not just scientific naturalism, evolutionary naturalism, scientism, and epistemic empiricism, naive empiricism. It's also an assumption of pragmatism, that simply producing quote-unquote results in a lab advances humanity somehow, and the storehouse of human knowledge is that much greater because there's a new footnote on rat hearing. Now, in a sense it's true, and in a sense it's not true. I mean, in a sense, yeah, okay, there is an advancement. But the idea of progress and advance is, again, something that doesn't make any sense on that worldview. Why? Because advance or progress, complexity, moving in a certain direction from one level of simplicity to another level of complexity, is itself a metaphysical idea. This should be so obvious. I don't understand why people can't get this. It's obvious that the idea of there being advance, progress, from simplicity to complexity of understanding or technology or whatever, that's loaded with metaphysics. I mean, how do you people not see this? Those of you out there that are not up on this. That's a metaphysical idea. Complexity, progress, these are value judgments that are loaded with metaphysics. This is so obvious. I mean, I don't know how else. I mean, you might say, well, how do you prove that? Well, I mean, I don't even know how else to prove it. It's just by the nature of what it is. I mean, if you're saying that something is progressing, you're assuming all kinds of metaphysical things that should be completely obvious. Like that thing exists out in the world. That complexity is something that's objectively, logically existing state of affairs that you can observe and track over time. Those are all metaphysical claims that you in your naturalist, atheist, evolutionary scheme don't have any rights to believe in. You don't have any basis to believe in existing entities objectively over time, retaining their identity. That's a huge metaphysical argument. Yet you just assume that that's the case and go on like you're some sort of genius. Well, you're not. You're an idiot. And why do I say you're an idiot? You may not be an idiot in the complexities and intricacies of rat hearing, but you are an idiot as it comes to basic philosophical metaphysical claims. And anybody who knows metaphysics knows that's a huge metaphysical problem. And I don't mean a problem in the negative sense. I just mean it's a great question. What do we mean when we talk about a singular object in the world exhibiting over time progress? And by this we might say, whether we're examining the lifespan of the earthworm or the intricacies of rat hearing, these are very complex mysteries that we are solving, that we come to a greater store of knowledge about this thing. Well, to be able to sit there and track the progress of this thing assumes that you are able to pick out of the phenomena of experience one thing, the rat ear, universalize that about all other rat ears, or most rat ears, and interpret the phenomena of your experience as going in a certain way that you call progress. That's what we call a value judgment. And a better way to analyze value judgments is in the question of ethics. I mean, when we talk about ethics and we say this action was immoral, this action was reprehensible, this action was virtuous, morally praiseworthy, those are value judgments. But value judgments aren't just made in the sphere of ethics. Value judgments are also made in the sphere of metaphysics and epistemology. And this is difficult for you who take that ridiculous worldview, because you're going to try to do all this stuff and make all these value claims, value judgments that make no sense on your worldview. They're just arbitrarily imposed by you. There's no objectively existing values in a completely evolutionary scheme. Now, it may be the case that I have a basis to believe in metaphysically objective existing notions or principles, or what we might call an entelechy, that causes an object or an entity to move from one state of simplicity to a state of complexity. This force, this principle within the organism or object or whatever we're talking about. Whether it's a earthworm or a computer. I mean, I can explain how that is. And it makes sense and is coherent within a system where the universe is ordered in a certain way, and there's a God, and there's a basis for metaphysical principles, there's a basis for value judgments. On your scheme, those things make absolutely no sense. I mean, it goes so far that you talking and making arguments doesn't make any sense. Because for you to argue, to make claims, assumes things like laws of logic. It assumes things like principles that govern linguistic interactions. It assumes things like symbolic, semiotic principles of usage of symbols and interaction, which ultimately can be sort of grouped under things like mathematics or invariant logical entities that subsist over time, that have some kind of immaterial, invariant form of existence. And I mean, this goes back to Plato and Philosophy 101. And I'm not saying that Plato's right and everything, but I'm saying that this is a question that Plato raised that is so obvious and so clearly the case that anyone who begins on a track of philosophical enlightenment they should begin with this kind of approach. But of course, you're not taught this in your university education. 99% of the time, you're taught this bogus bunch of bullshit that is designed to make you stupid. And that's why so many of you are stupid, is because you just follow along in this herd mindset of evolutionary theory and Darwinism because perceived authority figures have told you this. And I'm talking about your biology professor or your whoever professor, because he has letters before his name. Somehow that means that he's tapped into, the answers, of existence and life and all that. Well, I'm here to tell you that really the letters before his name don't really mean anything. I mean, again, he might know a lot about rat hearing because he was hyper-specialized. That's the whole track of modern education, following the Prussian scheme of how education should be constructed, which again comes out of Frederick the Great, who himself was a Jacobin Enlightenment illuminist despot. You don't realize that your whole modern education structure was constructed by a statist notion of human advancement that comes out of the Enlightenment and Illuminism, the actual historical Illuminati, right? That's all bound up with Enlightenment rationalism. And when Frederick of Prussia and his Illuminist court and cohorts devised the basis for all modern education, it was all bound up in all these assumptions that I'm talking about. Enlightenment, rationalist empiricism. And all of that is complete baloney. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't smart men like Voltaire who was operating within that system, that wrote, interesting tracts and treatises on this and that. It doesn't mean that he wasn't a cultured individual. It doesn't mean that, the philosophers who had this same worldview, that they didn't, collect and and tabulate a lot of human knowledge in the encyclopedia. The encyclopedists, right? That doesn't mean that that's all false. It means that the worldview, the foundational grounding assumptions that these men had are flawed, and seriously flawed, such that over time this worldview produces a certain kind of world. It produces the modern world that we live in. Now, smarter men in academia and in classics and in other various disciplines and in quantum physics and in metaphysics and in mathematics have already moved on past all this, right? And they've seen, I mean, I can list you many of them that know that this whole bunch of stuff is baloney. But you don't know about this. You're not taught about this. You don't learn this stuff. All you learn is the Darwinian standardized education that's all bullshit and ridiculous. And you were purposefully taught all that to keep you stupid. To keep you in a certain kind of box, in a little hamster wheel that will retard your mental progress and development. And you will not be able to see deeper level connections. You will not be able to understand how immaterial, invariant, logical entities like numbers interact with a world that's in constant flux, right? So you are, like Lenin said, caught up in the realm of flux. For Lenin, his communism, his Sovietism, was one by which the only way to move history was to be constantly in a state of chaos and flux. And so his theory of terrorism was bound up with his acceptance of naturalism and Darwinism. Same with Marx. The advance, quote unquote, of man could only come about by destruction. And this is straight out of Darwinism, right? The survival of the fittest. But that's a different route to take. But I bring it up because it's important to understand that these theories don't operate in isolation. That's crucial as a philosophical point. It's not possible to have an abstracted rationalist perspective on something that's divorced from the rest of your life or the rest of that society's operation. In other words, if you introduce a bunch of Marxism and a bunch of Darwinism to a society, it's not going to be something that just is self-contained within academia or self-contained within the political sphere. It's going to trickle down and affect all of that society like a virus. And that's, of course, where we are in the modern world. Fabian socialism, oligarchical elitism, Darwinism, Marxism are the root problems of what is destroying our entire world. And that's really the source, that's the ideological source of why we see such collapse, devastation, and destruction. Because these ideologies, we could view them like they are operating systems or programs. They are viruses that ultimately destroy the computer, the system that they're on. If you view your computer as a sort of a highly logical, a little logic machine, when I interject the Marx virus and the Darwin virus, these operate like a cancer that over time drags down and destroys the whole computer operating system, and the system eventually just shuts off, right? Or maybe even, just shorts out and the power, the screen goes, the blue screen of death or whatever. And in the same way, these systems, these narratives, these beliefs are themselves viruses for humanity, human civilization, and for the world. Darwinism is, of course, one of those main viruses that has gone viral. And it appeals to the pride and ego of man, and that's why it's so successful, in the same way that Darwinism does. I mean, in the same way that Marxism does. When Marx wrote Das Kapital, when he wrote the manifesto, he wrote a thank you to Darwin, because Marx understood what Darwin was and what he represented. He didn't just represent scientific advancement, so-called, but he represented a complete replacement of the old. Right? He represented revolution, even if Darwin himself didn't, believe that or recognize that. Marx saw him as that, and so he implemented that theology. And Darwinism is a theology. It's an immanentist, pantheistic theology. Marx implemented that into his economic theory and ultimately his worldview. Hitler did the same. If you look at Mein Kampf, it's very influenced by Darwin as well. It's just a different it's a different path than Marx, but it bears a lot of similarities, and Darwinism is one of those key areas of similarity. So but back to this main argument that I have, that I think brings the whole thing down, the unifying principle. When we talk about metaphysics, when we talk about worldviews, systems of belief, logic, argumentation, mathematics, these different disciplines ultimately subsumed under the worldview, under your operating system, your how you approach the world. Just to speak sort of generically in metaphysics, one has the necessity for a unifying principle. Now, for some people, for the ancient Greeks, a unifying principle might just be a generic impersonal force, the one, the all, which for many of the Greeks was sort of a pantheistic thing. Aristotle talks about the prime mover. For Aristotle, that's kind of his unifying principle. It's for him, it's thought thinking itself. It's the great mind. But fortunately for Aristotle, that mind that's only thinking about itself, that self-referential great mind in the sky, doesn't really have any direct interaction with the world. For Plato, the one is the monad, the great unifying principle that ultimately is present in everything. Yet how this is, we're not really sure, because in Platonism, the world that we experience of flux is more of a pale reflection that's nothing like the ideal world, which is ultimately metaphysically the one. So for Plato, there's the problem of monism and dualism, and for Aristotle, there's the same problem of monism and dualism. But these are examples of what I'm talking about. A unifying principle, some principle of individuation, some lever upon which we can state that this is truth, or this is what unifies all my beliefs and my claims. There's nothing wrong with speaking about the one, just so long as listeners don't think that I'm advocating classic Platonism or Pythagoreanism, because there are problems with that view. But suffice to say that just from a philosophical perspective, just to sort of speak in generic metaphysic terms, when a person makes a claim like, there are no metaphysical truths, or all reality is in a state of evolutionary flux, or something like that, as I said earlier, that claim makes a lot of assumptions. But the greatest assumption that any claim makes is that there is a unifying principle. In order for you to make that claim, you need some way to access or some way to string together all the predicates that you make of the world, or all the beliefs that you have of the world, all the truths, all the experiences that you've had. Something needs to unify these things for them to be logical or sensible or rational. Your own past is not something that you're presently experiencing. But certainly most of us don't want to say that the past never existed, correct? I mean, that doesn't really... I mean, there may be some philosophical naysayer out there who wants to, for the sake of argument, say, well, there was no past. That was not real. Which becomes problematic for, the fact that a minute later his argument would no longer be true because his argument happened in the past. But clearly, then, if we were to argue against the past ever happening, we would be caught up then in a completely ridiculous position. It would be a reductio ad absurdum. It would reduce to absurdity to think that the past never happened, because anytime we would make the claim the past never happened, it would then 1 second later no longer be true. So in other words, there's a certain eternality that we need for any kind of claim, or for any kind of predicate, for any kind of truth. There is an eternality to truth claims. If I say something like, well, let's take the past again. The past, let's say the past happened, okay? If we take that claim, that is a metaphysical and epistemological claim, and most people would not deny it. The past occurred. The events of the past occurred. Now, that might seem absurd to a lot of listeners or readers. Well, who would question that? Well, that's what we philosophers do. We look at those kinds of things and we say, well, no, on the surface that might seem absurd, but when we delve into the depths of Darwinism, evolutionary theory, empiricism, etc., atheism, those aren't absurd questions, because those are the kinds of questions that show us that very simple things, very simple common sense beliefs, actually presume a lot of metaphysics, a whole baggage of metaphysical truths and claims. And all that baggage is very problematic for these people. It's very problematic for the atheist, materialist, dogmatist, because he has no reason to believe in those things. He has no explanation for those things. He has no coherent way to explain those things. And the main reason, as I've said, is because he has no unifying principle in his worldview. So, a unifying principle, then, is needed for any kind of belief system or worldview or theory or paradigm. And the reason for that is becomes pretty obvious, because how are you going to link all these disparate facts, these disparate pieces of information, these different phenomena that you've encountered, whether it's the experimentation that you've done in your lab, or the what you've gone out into the field and experienced, studying archaeology or biology, whatever. How are you going to link these different experiences? How are you going to link the different conceptual categories that you've used to classify all these different phenomena? If you don't have a unifying principle, then what you've done is simply utilize something that doesn't make sense on your worldview. There's no meaningful reason or basis to connect all these different facts of experience. And this goes back to Platonism, it goes back to linguistic philosophy. When you predicate something, when you talk about the green, plant life that you're examining, when you talk about the earthworm that is, however many centimeters long and this and that, those are attributions of characteristics or predicates, statements of apparent objective meaning about an object in the world that you are then connecting to other conceptual truths about that object. The earthworm is 7 centimeters long, right? So you're utilizing the concept of 7. You're utilizing some notion of measurement, of extension within space. This is a specific earthworm in a specific point in time. So these are metaphysical ideas. And what most opponents to the worldview that I'm presenting, to theism, creationism, etc., what most opponents who adopt the evolutionary view say is just that none of that matters. We don't care about that. Well, you don't get to just arbitrarily say you don't care about that, because in debate, in philosophy, and logic, and reasoning and argumentation, all of which are part of the scientific method. Reasoning is what's going on here. Reasoning is assumed in the highly logical process of the scientific method. You don't get to just wipe away what is uncomfortable or doesn't work for you. Yet that's what probably 90 to 95% of the people that I've had this debate with do. They just say, we don't care. So what? And they do that as a power play because they realize that if they realize that their system doesn't work like they want it to on the desired presuppositions that they want to have that conflict with the other presuppositions that they have, then the easiest route is to just say, we don't care about metaphysics. We don't care about that. None of that matters. I'm going to arbitrarily ad hoc just chop off where I think science goes and science ends and metaphysics begins. Well, the problem with that is that there's no such thing as a rationalist scheme that avoids metaphysics. Any claim you make at all about the world, any belief that you have, any action at all presumes all kinds of metaphysics, whether you want it to or not. And my job as a philosopher is to come along and to say to you that have the theory, the grand narrative, or the non-grand narrative that you think is just a theory about earthworms. No, in actual fact, you can't make a statement at all without necessarily implying some grand narrative or worldview. Because to make a statement such as the earthworm is 7 centimeters, again, implies a manifold of necessary metaphysical and epistemological implications. Even though you're not specifically saying it at that moment, it entails all those things by necessity, obviously. All the types of things that I've listed, like that you're an existing self that's able to study objects in the world. Well, unless you have some conception of a self, a psyche, a mind, a soul, or whatever, that doesn't make any sense. What you're doing is just useless nonsense. Now, again, that doesn't mean that I'm saying everything that you study is useless nonsense. I'm saying that on your scheme, on that basis, on that worldview, on that presupposition, what you're doing doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't make sense ultimately, in the final analysis, the big kicker, because there's not any kind of unifying principle to make sense of all the string of your experiences. Van Til would talk about the golden chain of experiences and how it's like a pearl necklace. You don't have a string to link these things. The phenomena that you experienced yesterday or last week or a year ago have no meaningful relation or connection to the present events that you're experiencing or doing in your lab or whatever you're doing, because there's no unifying principle. And why is there no unifying principle? Because by definition, in this worldview, a unifying principle cannot exist. The closest thing that can be given as a unifying principle in this kind of worldview is the mind. But the mind of humans is finite. So a finite human mind is not something that we can seriously utilize as something that can unify all the facts of experience. Now, this happened in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when the switch away from metaphysics and objective theism turned to scientism and psychologism. Ultimately, that's where it leads, and then into solipsism. You see that in people like Descartes. And so, when prior to this we located objective knowledge and metaphysics in God and in the divine mind, when the Renaissance and Enlightenment came about, all of that became something that was placed into the mind of man. And so the mind of autonomous individual man then took the place of the infinite mind of God, which prior to this period housed the eternal ideational concepts or logical entities that sort of stood back or behind or grounded reality, the physical reality that we experience. So, but again, it becomes very clear, very evident when you consider the thesis and actually trying to work out the possibility of a human finite mind being the ground of metaphysics and reality, trying to be a unifying principle. It's completely impossible. For one, it's finite. It's located in a specific place in time and history at all points. Right? I mean, the human mind itself never transcends finitude, and it never transcends any specific place in space and time. I mean, there might be, in more speculative questions, a deeper connection to spiritual realities or so forth. But regardless, that's not somewhere that people of this evolutionary mindset want to go. They are confined to a very limited, extremely limited, empirical series of phenomena that they experience. And that limitation, that small, tiny box, is completely antithetical to being some kind of unifying principle. In other words, you can't even unify your own individual experience, much less explain how in the external objective world all of these different phenomena relate to one another. How does the earthworm that you're studying have any kind of meaningful, sensible connection to some other earthworm, right? That Aristotle classed according to genus and species and so forth. That classification, that taxonomy that science uses, has to only be a sociological linguistic construction, a token symbol or term, to use their terminology. What you're calling an earthworm, what you're thinking that you're predicating about, is just something that is just an agreed upon term that has no meaning outside of what immediate experience creates for it. And that's why ultimately this whole position leads to, in other words, empiricism itself, scientific empiricism, leads just directly to solipsism. It really has no grounding at all, precisely because it eliminates and negates from the outset, its presuppositions eliminate and negate any kind of unifying principle. And what I mean by unifying principle, of course, is God, is the divine mind, is an infinite, omniscient mind, which is able to ground these essences, these eidon, the ideals, the principles, the archetypes, the meanings behind things, if you will, the eternality of the truth. Like I said, now, what do you mean by the eternality of truth? Well, like I said, when we make a statement like the earthworm was 7 centimeters, right? And let's say the earthworm gets chopped in half. It's the same earthworm, but it is still nevertheless true that the earthworm at one point was 7 centimeters, correct? Right. The trueness of that claim or that proposition will always be true, right? It will never be the case, even though it's no longer the case, it will never be the case that the earthworm was not 7 centimeters. And what that shows us is that there's an eternality to truth, even to something that comes to be within time at a certain point that wasn't true maybe prior to that. Let's say the earthworm just grew and reached 7 centimeters. At that point in time, it is objectively true that it was 7 centimeters, and that truth of that proposition will always be the case. It will always be the case that at one point in time, the earthworm was 7 centimeters. Therefore, it can never be the case that it was never 7 centimeters, right? And that the trueness of that proposition continues on regardless of human knowledge of that fact, right? Like even if we hadn't been studying it and the earthworm reached 7 centimeters, it was still objectively, eternally the case and true that the earthworm reached 7 centimeters. So the real absurdity of this view is the end result of saying that, it's that ridiculous pseudo-philosophical question of, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there, did it happen? Did it make a sound? Well, of course it did. Because phenomena of experience are not ultimately dependent on the human mind as grounding their objective existence in reality. Ultimately, it's dependent on the divine mind. And so this means then that rather than grounding objectivity or truth or archetypes or essences or eidon or whatever in eidos in the finite human mind, ultimately these are grounded in an infinite divine mind, and then thus every single particle in the universe, every single object, every single phenomena is meaningful, and infinitely so, because it's placed within an infinite mind, the divine mind, that gives it meaning. And so the human mind then interprets reality analogically because it has this grounding assumption of a divine mind as the ground of all reality. And that's radically different than the atheistic, materialist, pantheist, immanentist worldview that begins with the human mind, and therefore ultimate reality is not rational, it is irrational. Because if you don't have a unifying principle that's a divine mind, then the ultimate power or principle operative in the universe is chaos, and it's irrational. And a totality perspective or narrative of ultimate reality being irrational means that the seeming rationality that you construct in your lab or in your scientific endeavors is thus illusory. Even though there may seem to be patterns that you're noticing with these earthworms and with these, biological constructs that you've created for your scientific journals, all these words and these terms, even though it seems to be the case, ultimately there's no unifying principle that's rational, because there's no ultimate divine mind, there's no God. The ultimate force or power in the universe is simply flux, chaos, and change. And if the ultimate grandest scale of things is flux, chaos, change, indeterminacy, then all of your localized, historical, individual perceptions of meaning, order, events succeeding one another in some rational succession, that's all illusory. Because it's just a seeming order or a seeming complexity or a seeming connection that's really just foisted upon reality by an individual finite mind. It's not something that's actually objectively out there in the world. And really this just completely annihilates the entire evolutionary, atheistic, Darwinistic scheme. This alone is just the most powerful, completely destructive philosophical critique or argumentation that could be made. I mean, when the entire scheme is unworkable because of its grounding foundational presuppositions, I mean, there's no stronger argument that could be made logically and philosophically. It's just complete incoherency and nonsense. Why? Because it's trying to utilize the biggest, strongest powers and principles that would make sense in a theistic scheme in order to argue against a theistic scheme. And that's crucial. It's just like Wittgenstein's Tractatus, where you use all these words to argue against meaning and to argue against language and narrative and coherency. And here you are using language, narrative, and coherency to say that there's no such thing as language, narrative, and coherency. It's just nonsense. It's no different than the claim that there's no truth when that claim itself is a truth claim. And these are not paradoxes. Paradox is very different from a contradiction. These are flat out, complete, total contradictions. They are irrational, they're illogical, and they're ultimately power plays, which I guess that kind of makes sense on a Darwinian survival of the fittest scheme, because in that scheme, you're not ultimately discovering truth. You are making power plays. So the trueness or falseness of a proposition or belief really becomes irrelevant. It's just who's the best at the power play. But that's ultimately irrational, because Darwinism, scientism, so forth, claim to be and presume to be the heights of rationality, logic, and coherence. But in fact, they are not. And so thus, no unifying principle outside of a finite, ever-changing human consciousness or mind, which of course Darwinian atheists have a very hard time explaining what that is, what a human mind or consciousness is, if it even exists at all. No unifying principle outside of that means that the system, the belief, the worldview as a whole is completely destructive, completely incoherent, complete nonsense, and can't even get off the ground. And so there's no possible way, beginning with those foundations, which they haven't usually delved into or thought about or questioned, there's no way to build up a superstructure, a belief system, a grand narrative with that completely faulty foundation and starting point.